we're going to compare Blackmagic RAW or BRAW versus ProRes. Now, for context, I've been shooting with the Ursa Mini since the original 4.6K, not even the Ursa Mini Pro, which is also 4.6K, or the G2, which is also 4.6K. No, the original 4.6K way back when. And at the time, RAW workflow with Blackmagic cameras was not very well refined. It was a little clunky, it was a little complicated. So I got very comfortable shooting ProRes, and I have been for the past, what's it been? 4 or 5 years, however long it's been. So ProRes has become my standard workflow because ProRes is a great codec, very easy to edit, has a lot of color information. So even if you're shooting in a film mode, like, you're totally fine. Plenty of dynamic range. It's really hard to overexpose the Ursa Mini Pro or the original or the Gen 2 now. There's a lot you can do with just ProRes. Now, RAW is the preferred format for most people because it gives you so much flexibility, but I haven't really adopted it into my workflow until recently, now that Blackmagic has incorporated kind of a better version of Blackmagic RAW. They keep updating their codec to be better and better and better. And their next generation RAW codec, they say the quality of RAW at the speed of video. So we're gonna test this out, look at the differences in terms of like how much space you're gonna save or that it's gonna cost you if you're shooting RAW versus ProRes, as well as the flexibility of editing these files within Premiere, because that's what I use. Of course, if you use DaVinci Resolve, you're probably gonna get a lot better results just because Resolve is the Blackmagic platform. But Premiere kind of works and suits my needs for the way I work on stuff. So there is a plugin, and we'll talk about all that. But basically, they've got all this great stuff. They keep updating it, which is the benefits of RAW, right? Refined color science over time. You have that raw sensor data, so you can kind of do with it what you want as technology gets better. So you can check this out. This is on the Blackmagic website. Obviously, that's where you download it from. The actual download is a little misleading. So there's this RAW player if you just want to look at RAW footage on your laptop. It works great. You can preview it in Finder if you're on a Mac system. You can get that, but that player comes as part of the full SDK, which is what you want if you're going to be using the plugin with inside Premiere and on your machine as well. And this comes with some other cool stuff. They have a little speed test that you can do, and I can start this, and it'll basically analyze your computer hardware to see what you can do and what you can't. You can see based on my current specs what this laptop is capable of, and we'll get into some of that performance stuff later, but it's a nice little tool they have, so you don't have to run your own tests, kind of do performance tracking in Premiere or whatever your program is, your NLE of choice. They give you a tool to test that, which I thought was kind of a nice, helpful thing. And you can see that there's certain styles of RAW that will work with my machine and other ones that won't. So you can go check this out. Of course, you download it from right here. And before we get into any of the actual footage, because I know that's probably the most interesting part is the footage, what maybe is less interesting, but is maybe more practical, is the storage requirements for a RAW workflow. Like I said, I've gotten very used to ProRes because back in the day, RAW was a lot bigger, ProRes a lot smaller, and in terms of cost for hard drives and storage and whatnot, ProRes made a lot of sense, and I've just gotten used to kind of working around it. And again, the Ursa Mini has tons of dynamic range that you can store in ProRes anyway, so most of the stuff I've worked on, it hasn't really been a need. It's not like I've shot something and gone, oh, I wish I had RAW. I've always been kind of fine with the ProRes, but people have been talking about BRAW and how amazing it is and all the different compression ratios. So I thought I would test it out myself and finally maybe take the plunge and see if I want to switch from ProRes to RAW. So how I did that was I shot a bunch of test clips, and we're going to get to these ones later. But I basically went through the camera and shot basically switching all the different menu options for your codecs, your resolutions, and it's just a very boring process going through here, hitting all the menu stuff. But one thing I will commend Blackmagic on is that their menus just work so well. Obviously, you can see you can pick ProRes, you can pick your compression, you can pick your resolution. It's all separate, so you're not dealing with all these little chiclet tiles that you get on some other camera menus where it's all in one thing and you end up with like 100 different options. You can kind of pick and choose what you want based on your requirements. So I went through and I set up all that, checking the times for all the cards. For a 256 gig card, basically how long could I shoot? Because that's kind of the practicality of it. Oftentimes when we're talking about RAW and versus ProRes and all the different compression ratios, we know that, you know, typically bigger file sizes are going to give better results in terms of image quality, maybe flexibility and color grading. But oftentimes that's met with the limitation of the budget and just being like, well, I can't dedicate a whole terabyte to this one, shoot that I'm doing. Maybe even it could be even beyond that, 2 terabytes, 4 terabytes. And then if you're doing any kind of RAID setup or you're doing offsite backups, you're doing cloud storage, the files get really big really fast. And if you want redundancy, then it like duplicates, the entire file size. So it can be a nightmare dealing with these really, really big files. So what's the practical use case for each of these different things? When would you want to shoot ProRes? When would you want to shoot BRAW? Depending on those hard set limitations of maybe you just don't have the budget for terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data. So I went through and I logged all that in a nice little spreadsheet. It's not all that pretty, but you can see all the stuff is logged here. And I'll just go through this really, really quick. So in this side in the blue, we have ProRes, and on the other side in kind of the orangey gold, we've got BRAW. Again, this is a 256 gigabyte card. It's a CFast card. So here you have in this column the compression for ProRes. On the Ursa Mini Pro, you have a lot of ProRes options. They even give you down to proxy, which is fantastic, that you can even go that low all the way up to XQ. And then if you're shooting ultra high definition, basically 4 times HD, UHD, you have that option, as well as the 4.6K like maximum resolution on the Ursa Mini. So these are all listed in minutes. So if you're going to basically, the most you can get out of an Ursa Mini Pro in terms of total record time from a 256 gigabyte card is shooting ProRes proxy at 230 minutes total at UHD, which is 4K for most intents and purposes. That's basically the most you can get, 4K quality. Of course, you could drop it down to 1080p if you wanted to do that, but I think most of us nowadays are looking at, okay, I want to shoot 4K. What's the most I can get for that? And for a 256 gigabyte card, you can record for basically 230 minutes. So more or less, ProRes proxy on the Ursa Mini Pro is basically a gig a minute of 4K or Ultra HD. From there, if you want to jump up to Lite, ProRes Lite, that's a big, big jump. Basically, half of your record time is going to be, taken away just by switching from proxy to Lite. So that's a pretty big jump. From there, it evens out a little bit more. So 422, you have 71 minutes. HQ, you have 47 minutes. 444, you have 31 minutes. And XQ, you have 21 minutes of Ultra HD. Again, I know this is kind of boring, but hopefully this is helpful in painting a picture of like, well, maybe you don't need XQ, even though that's, the best version of ProRes. If you're recording UHD, you only get 21 minutes for a 256 gigabyte card. Imagine how fast you'll go through that if you're recording interviews or doing any kind of long form. Maybe it's a wedding and you have to record the whole, reception and ceremony and everything involved. And if you have multiple cameras, then just factor it by that. Maybe there's 2 or 3 cameras. Now you're multiples of these numbers. So it can eat into your data really fast. Also, for comparison, is the 4.6K, which more resolution means less record time because it's just going to take up more data on that card. So for 4.6K with ProRes proxy of 160 minutes, and then again, that big jump to ProRes Lite, 70 minutes, 422 is 49 minutes, HQ is 33 minutes, and then 444 is 21 minutes, and then XQ is 14 minutes. 14 minutes for a 256 gigabyte card. That's a very expensive project, needless to say. Now let's jump over to the Blackmagic RAW side, because rather than it being proxy and Lite and 422 and kind of these arbitrary things, they just use compression ratios for their RAW codec. So we have 12:1, 8:1, 5:1, and 3:1. There's another mode on the Blackmagic you can switch it to, but I figured for like compression of RAW data, what are we looking at? Let's compare that. Now, the one thing I will say for Ultra HD for BRAW, because it's RAW, and this is really important, it isn't scaling down the 4.6K. If you're shooting ProRes proxy, let's say Ultra HD, you're going to get the full field of view of a 4.6K sensor, and it's scaling that down to Ultra HD in the camera. Of course, you can window the sensor, and that's an option on the Ursa Mini Pro, but you're getting the full field of view of the full sensor and then scaled down to Ultra HD. With RAW, it's RAW, so it's just the strict sensor data, so there's no scaling going on here. So if you're recording Ultra HD, it's going to be slightly cropped on the sensor because the sensor itself is 4.6K. You're recording a smaller portion of that, so it is going to be cropped or windowed if you're recording Ultra HD BRAW on the Ursa Mini Pro. So really, to get the full field of view in BRAW, you really need to be in the 4.6K mode. It may or may not apply to you depending on your scenario, but it is something to know that with the ProRes stylings, you can get the full field of view in any kind of resolution. With RAW, you're going to be cropping in on the sensor, and that makes sense because it's RAW. Anyway, Ultra HD BRAW is 164 minutes at that 12:1 compression. So it's not as lightweight, let's say, as ProRes Proxy. And again, it's windowed, but it is lighter weight than ProRes LT, which is kind of like the light version of ProRes. And I will say ProRes Proxy, and we'll get to this a little bit later when we look at some of the footage, ProRes Proxy on the Ursa Mini Pro doesn't look bad. When I say proxy, you might think, oh, proxy files are really like low res and really bad. No, it's more heavily compressed, and so you can't push and pull it as much, but right out of the box, it's not like it looks bad when you pull it into Premiere or your NLE of choice. It still looks relatively good at 4K or 4.6K. So Ultra HD, we have 164 minutes, and then we're not doing that like giant leap for to 8:1. It's kind of the difference between proxy and light on the ProRes side is not the same as it is on the 12:1, 8:1. These are kind of aligned for their kind of close proximity, but really it's not about ProRes versus RAW. It's more just like what total runtime can you record from this card. So you have 110 minutes at 8:1 Ultra HD. At 5:1 you have 68 minutes, and then at 3:1 you have 41 minutes. And 3:1 is basically like really nice RAW. It is compressed, but it's 3:1, so it's not as heavily compressed as 12:1. And then 4.6K if you really want to get that the maximum field of view for the Super 35 sensor that's in the Ursa Mini Pro. At 12:1, basically the lightest weight RAW but still full width sensor you can get is 115 minutes for a 256 gigabyte card. So roughly about the same as like ProRes Lite. So if you were shooting ProRes Lite Ultra HD, you could instead switch to like 4.6K BRAW 12:1. Like those are kind of the trade-offs you'd make. Like you'd say, okay, normally I record ProRes Proxy, so maybe I'm looking at, Ultra HD BRAW, or maybe normally I record Ultra HD ProRes Lite, so now I'm looking at 4.6K BRAW. You can kind of compare based on runtime and project requirements and budgets, really, what maybe the best option is for you with the camera. 8:1, you got 76 minutes, 5:1, 48 minutes, and then 3:1, 4.6K, basically the best RAW, compressed RAW, that BRAW that you can get from the Ursa Mini Pro. 4.6K will give you 28 minutes with a 256 gigabyte card, which again, is kind of in that realm of ProRes, but actually better than, in terms of data load compared to the ProRes HQ, where that kind of same maximum quality would only be 14 minutes. So it really depends on what your goals are for the project, what you're trying to get out of it, all the different stuff. It's like a lot of numbers and different codecs and different flavors. Thankfully, the Ursa does make it really easy to kind of pick and choose between these things because it's not that bad. Using the menu makes it really nice. And once you kind of get used to it, you can kind of see how it works. And I will show you when you go into the RAW mode, you can see that Ultra HD, you see there real subtly, it says resolution, it says sensor windowed. You can't change that when you're doing Blackmagic RAW and you're doing Ultra HD. Something really important to note. And then, so yeah, you can see constant bitrate is where you have those compression ratios. If you switch it to constant quality, you can kind of set like a baseline, like Q0, I think is basically the best quality you can get. But I think more people would probably be shooting with the compression ratios just because it's a little bit more like intuitive in terms of like the file savings and stuff. But I really haven't tested the constant quality as much. I wanted to focus more on the constant bit rate and those different ratios. So if we bounce over here into the footage, we can take a look at kind of how this all plays out into practice. And I just shot this a couple hours ago. The sun was setting. I was like, those clouds, those highlights, like let's record this and see what we get, switching as fast as I could between all the different settings to make sure I'm capturing it before the sun, you know, sets too much and then the test is not all that valid. Now I will say I made the terrible mistake of leaving the camera in the video extended mode. I should have checked. The sun was setting. I was in a rush. I was like, hey, that looks beautiful. I'm going to film that real quick. And I didn't put it into film mode. So this isn't a perfect test. I need to do more testing to really see, but this will at least show you what the video extended mode looks like from the Ursa Mini Pro. Not the maximum dynamic range you can get. Obviously, film mode is going to be more like a log profile, where video extended is kind of more like Rec 709 with more dynamic range than the plain old video mode, which clips very, very quickly. So anyway, here I've got a bunch of stuff in Premiere, and I'll say I can play this back. Hopefully, while I'm streaming this, it still works, but editing both the RAW and the ProRes, buttery smooth, even on just this MacBook Pro laptop. It's nothing fancy. I'm sure if you have a decked out PC at home, it'll do much better. If you're in DaVinci Resolve, that's probably better. But in Premiere,
all right, this is RAW
plays
3 to
fine.
1.
Plays great.
And this is RAW 12 to 1.
Very impressed with the RAW playback. Once you install the BRAW software, it works in Premiere great. And what's cool is on these clips, if you go up to the master clip, you have all of that raw data control that you'd get with maybe like red footage or other raw codecs built right into Premiere, ready to grab. It is under the master section though. So on, like, this is a ProRes clip. So if I click on this and I go to master, there's nothing there. But this clip here is a raw clip, and there's no real easy way to tell in the timeline. They just look like video clips all stitched together. This one, if you click on master, you get this Blackmagic raw kind of functionality, and it'll come in with the camera metadata. So it basically comes in looking as it was shot, but you can go by clip and then change your color science, change your white balance, change all sorts of stuff. Down here you have your saturation, contrast, midpoint, all that other stuff. Now, with the ProRes options, you don't have that same functionality, so you would be, you know, going with Lumetri or whatever your color corrector of choice is. And again, this isn't the film mode on the Ursa Mini. This is the video extended, so not quite the maximum dynamic range. If you want to see what that looks like, I did switch it later on, and that's this clip here. I boost the exposure because this is how it was shot. The sun had basically gone, and now I was dealing with, like, okay, capture whatever I can as the sun's setting and getting very, very dark. Let me see what I did to this clip, because I definitely changed my exposure there. So if I change that to 1, that should be kind of how they were shot initially. I wonder if I even need to go to exposure 0. That might be more accurate to how it was actually shot. Yeah, so basically this raw clip here and this ProRes clip here, same kind of deal. Really cool lightning actually tonight that I filmed this. Didn't capture any of it though. It was a shame. I really wanted to. But you can see just the playback is super, super smooth for both of these. This is 12 to 1 here, and then this is ProRes Proxy. And hopefully you can tell as I'm scrubbing through this stuff, there really isn't any obvious difference that's going to stand out. If I jump through these, you probably can't even tell a difference. Honestly, like, I know it's a stream, so the quality is going to be reduced, but if I go and I make this full here, and I just jump through these clips, like, I don't see anything to my eye. I'm sure you don't see anything to your eye. If we zoom in even to, like, let's go 200%, which I usually don't like to zoom in this much, because, like, honestly, you know, typically 100% is, you know, as far as I'll go normally, because that's like kind of realistic. If you zoom in like 800%, it's like no one's watching content that way. So what's the point of, like, oh, 800%, look at this little mosaic pattern here. It's like, well, no one's going to notice that. No one's going to see it, because it's going to get compressed for YouTube or Netflix or Amazon or wherever it ends up. So if I zoom in here to 100%, know that, like, this beginning of this clip is probably shaking. That's what it is, because I have such a long focal length on here. So it might be better. This will be a little tricky because I can't do it at the beginning of each clip. But you can see this clip, and if I unmute myself, I recorded what each of these were, so I know.
All right, this is RAW 3 to 1.
So RAW 3 to 1, basically the best you can get on the Ursa Mini Pro. And that's what it looks like. And then this next clip I'm going to jump forward to is 12:1.
And this
Like,
is raw 12:1.
Do you notice any difference? No, you don't. I don't notice it, and I'm looking at it here, full screen, not, broadcast over the internet, compressed, streamed, all that stuff. But I can tell you, these clips look almost identical. And
This is ProRes XQ.
maximum ProRes XQ. And then let's skip ahead.
This is ProRes Proxy.
Again, very, very minor differences. Nothing that immediately stands out and being like, oh, wow, that's so inferior. No, in fact, they all look basically the same. Now, if we were to play around this with color grading and such, we can take a look at doing that. I haven't even done it myself yet because I just shot this, so we'll get to have that kind of experience together. But if I go in here, and so we can just mark it like this, I'll probably label it something green, just to say this is kind of like the best raw one. And maybe let's put our ProRes stuff up a track, so raw will be bottom, and this is kind of like our worst raw. So let's make that like red or something like bad. I don't know, I usually color code that way. And this one is our best ProRes, and this is kind of our worst ProRes proxy. I recorded them that close together because I wanted to test those ends. Of course, there's everything in between as we looked on this spreadsheet of all the different flavors you can mix and match in between. But what are the extremes? What's the absolute worst versus the absolute best? And just out of the box, at a glance, none of them stand out as being better or worse than the others. And hopefully that tells you something like pretty good about, granted, this shot, I'd have to do more testing, get some skin tones in there, different lighting conditions. But at a glance, don't feel like you're missing out, or you have to shoot XQ or 3:1 every single time and eat up terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of data because you think that it's somehow better than like the lower versions of ProRes or BRAW, when in fact at a glance they're all very, very similar. And that's important because if you do your job right on set and you shoot it properly, getting your white balance and your exposure proper, getting that all dialed in, well then you'd have less to worry about in post-production, worrying that, oh, I have to radically shift my white balance, or I'm gonna have to do major color grading and changing my exposure a lot. If you get it right or close to what you want in camera with, assuming you're gonna do some minor color grading, you're gonna put like a LUT on there or something, well, feel kind of confident that you can opt for some of the lower end codecs if you need to, and that's what your budget kind of dictates. So let's play around with this. Let's go to the master clip for this raw, and we're gonna stick with the Gen 4 color science. You could go to Gen 5. It is very, very different and better, but I haven't played around with it enough myself to actually know. So we're gonna stick with Gen 4. We're gonna keep the white balance as shot, and let's play around with it. Why not? See what we do with daylight, cloudy, shade. It's getting very tungsten. So this is fantastic that you can do this with a click of a button. I think that's one of the benefits of RAW, is that you can just change your white balance on the fly rather than with ProRes going in and having to like color grade it, if that makes sense. Of course, you could, your temperature and tint, or you could go into your curves and do all those adjustments to kind of mimic a white balance. But the fact that you have the raw data and you can go, oh yeah, it's tungsten, and it's right there, that I think is very helpful if you want that. But we'll keep it as shot for now. It was 5600, typical kind of daylight stuff, and then it's sunset, so it's looking a little, golden there. So you have different color space options that you could dig through. You have different gamma settings you could dig through. ISO, you can change it, 3200. It could have been shot that way. I didn't. I shot it at 800, so that's how it comes in. You could pull it down to 200, I suppose. Let's go full. Let's fit it, because now we're looking at the whole kind of spectrum here. So 800 here, and let's take a look at what we do with exposure. Like if we drop this way, way down, you're gonna see that even with RAW, even the best RAW, the 3:1 compression that we did, there's still some bits in those clouds there that were just too much to capture. Now granted, I shot this pretty, evenly balanced. I didn't severely underexpose it to save that stuff. But it's good to know that even if you're shooting RAW, it's not like I can save it forever into the highlights. So, this is how I shot it. Very, very bright. definitely impressive to be able to pull it down that much and have so much detail there. Of course, you probably wouldn't do it that way, but it's just for example. And then we can change some of the other stuff in here, the white level, the black level, the highlight roll off, the midpoint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Under exposure, we can go +5, -5, we can go tint, and you can play around with that stuff to your heart's desire. But what I'm curious is, on this exposure, if we take this all the way down to -5, what's the variation there that we have for ProRes if we were to do the same maneuver with Lumetri? Well, it doesn't work quite like that, does it? That's annoying. Let's pull this down and see. Well, let's first try and pull those highlights back in and see what we have. And we can pull, let me fit this again to the screen. And let's boost our shadows up, see kind of what we're playing with. Maybe we'll add a ton of contrast just so we can still see what we're looking at. Maybe just even it out to 50. And let's pull the whites down too, see what we have there. Interesting, interesting. And let's go to curves. Pull these down. Pull these down. In fact, I want to pull my whites down here to -100 and then zoom in here. Obviously, it's a much different look because it doesn't know, like RAW, you have your exposure and the BRAW does the exposure a little bit differently than Lumetri does. I don't actually really like how Lumetri handles exposure all that much. But when we zoom in here, that's a little too close. Let's zoom out to 100. You can see that same spot. We've definitely got some trouble there, and I definitely wouldn't pull my whites down that much. Let's see if we did like just -1. See, it's not gonna really handle the exposure the same way that, let's say, like the RAW integration does, which is unfortunate. So theoretically, we could stack these and just keep doing like highlight recovery, more or less. If we copy and paste it, and we paste it again, and we paste it again, and we paste it, like you can tear this apart. And this is like the highest grade ProRes there is. Of course, you would never do this because unless you wanted it to look like, I don't know, almost looks like a comic book. That's kind of a cool effect, actually. You're breaking the codec apart, and there's nothing left, but kind of a neat effect there. So we can play around with it. And again, I would say that this is a situation. Let's even do it to just the ProRes proxy, like the worst ProRes version we have. And like you can still pull those highlights down. You can get them back. Is it as good as what you can do with the RAW? Is it as flexible? It's close. You know, if you're looking at this full screen, hopefully you can see, you know, we're losing detail in the clouds there, but comparatively, it's not, you know, so much so that it's like, you know, the staggering difference between RAW and ProRes on this particular clip. And this is what I really like about the Ursa Mini Pro and just the Blackmagic cameras in general, giving you the flexibility to do both so you can figure out what fits your workflow. And thankfully, BRAW, even on this laptop, like we did with the speed test, it plays back really, really, really smooth. And so you can kind of pick, okay, well, I actually want the RAW flexibility and I'm willing to sacrifice some of my data, right? I don't want to do ProRes proxy and get 230 minutes, but I'll do 4.6K and get 115 at 12:1. You know, test this stuff out, see if it works for you. I'm going to do some more testing for myself just to see what really the limits are. But just on this one shot, if this is all you were filming, like a landscape or something of a sunset or whatnot, even the worst, you know, ProRes clip, we could grade and color and match if we spend some time to, and I would never color that this way. So let's maybe find something a little bit more pleasing that would, you know, be in alignment with what we'd want to do. Let's even just see what we can get with Lumetri here, doing kind of the same highlights, shadows. I don't know if I brought it up that much. No, it was at 100, yeah. And I pulled those curves down a little bit. You know, if we're looking at these two side by side, the worst ProRes versus the best BRAW. It's a little bit darker there in the shadows, isn't it, on the ProRes one? But I think that's kind of nitpicking at this point. Theoretically, if I go in here, maybe there's some extra settings we can do in here in the RAW modifier to pull some of that stuff back, but really, let's see, highlight roll off. It's going to be brighter, harsher. The differences, I think, are more minor than you might first expect. When people talk about RAW or they talk about, compression and all this stuff, it really is over some of the minutia, the nuance, the fine detail, the zooming in, having the flexibility to change your white balance or to dial in your ISO and your exposure and all that stuff, rather than having to rely on the color tools. But in general, you can still get away with a lot, even shooting with higher compression like the 12:1 or ProRes proxy. So I think this just, kind of reaffirms what I already knew going into it, even though looking at it, I have to do some more testing. It's that thing of, pick what makes sense for your budget. Base it on, okay, I'm recording a documentary with a ton of interviews. I just need the most time possible, but I still want it to be raw. So I'll do, Ultra HD and I'll deal with the crop factor. Or maybe you go ProRes proxy and you say, I don't have, a ton of budget for this. I just need to be able to record as much as possible every single day and, maximize my cards. And if you're doing it that way, like, you might be okay. Like I said, you'd have to base it on your project and do kind of your own testing to really know for sure, because I don't want you to take my recommendation and tell you to shoot ProRes proxy and you're, dissatisfied with the results because you can't grade it as much. But just know that the differences might not be as extreme as you might first expect with some of this stuff, because the data rates, you would think, oh my goodness, I'm getting so much more detail. I can recover those highlights. I can push those shadows. I have so much color detail. And in actuality, you might just be eating up hard drive space for data you don't even use or don't even need. So really test out yourself. I'm going to do some more testing. I'm glad I started this, because just for the fact of editing the BRAW footage, like playing this back in Premiere is so awesome that it's just this smooth, and you don't have those considerations of, it's cinema DNG files and it's going to take a long time to transcode, or if I import them, it's going to be sluggish. The BRAW plays great, just as equally as good as the ProRes. And this laptop, on a previous video, I was editing, some all-I footage from the S1H and the GH5, and we were looking at those formats, and they're so processor intensive. Like, the computer just slows to a complete halt. You can't really record video and stream and do Premiere all at the same time. The cameras are freezing. The computer's just basically on fire. Not literally, but you know what I mean. Like, it just has a really, really hard time compared to BRAW and ProRes that just play back no problem. Whether it's the high-end stuff, the low-end stuff, doesn't matter. It gets right through it. And this is, again, a laptop. It's not even, DaVinci Resolve on a proper PC that's maxed out. So if you have any considerations about like playback performance and the ability to edit the stuff, I'm just glad I did that test for myself to know that, hey, I can shoot basically whatever I want and it's going to play back in Premiere. I can preview it in Finder, because Blackmagic has this really cool SDK that they've got out there where you can basically treat it just like regular old, QuickTime files, which is really, really nice to see and very, very helpful. So I got to do some more tests with this, really play around with it, but the results are very promising, both for people who want the flexibility of RAW, but also the people who are afraid that they're going to, drain their bank account just shooting RAW clips. It's like, well, you can do the 12:1 compression and you can get pretty close there, like you can get pretty decent record times with BRAW at 12:1, and you might not be sacrificing as much as you might think. So I like doing that kind of stuff where you just see, hey, this just works and it's great and it's smooth and it's seamless. And then you can use it for all the creative fun. This is a lot of like technical numbers and boring looking at, pixels and coloring, but using it on a real project and having so much joy being able to switch your white balance with just the click of a button, I think that's pretty awesome.